Hello and welcome to the Alapaha Beef Research Station, located 30 miles east of the University of Georgia's Tifton campus. This station represents a lot of pasture land and cattle operations across the coastal plains. The soils here are very acidic and prone to flooding from the Alapaha River. The deep sands also prevent storage of soil water, and so a drought is never very far away. These challenges prevent us from growing many forages except bahia grass. Today I want to show you a few highlights from our winter grazing demonstration where we evaluated winter grazing options following summer and fall drought. Like many producers across the southeast, this station also faced a shortage of forage last fall and was unable to harvest enough hay in the summer. Much of the region was in a prolonged drought since May, which forced producers to start feeding an already limited hay supply earlier than anticipated. With the expectation of heavy rain from tropical storm systems, we made a plan to plant cool season annual forages in early fall to make up for part of the forage deficit. Our goal was to examine several possible forage contingency plans following these drought conditions. The Alapaha Research Station has about 125 acres of land that were available for use in this project. The acres remained fallow last summer because spring flooding prevented sorghum plantings and summer drought did not allow for a late millet planting. We allocated that annual land into 10 to 15 acre plots. Our 5 treatments included ryegrass planted in early fall, ryegrass planted normally, ryegrass planted late into winter, T-Raptor planted early, followed by ryegrass, and T-Raptor planted early, followed by ryegrass planted late into January. We collected hand samples each month to determine the forage yield and will ultimately create a forage profile for the farm. We also collected grazing records, including the number of animals and days spent grazing each pasture. Since the grazing is still ongoing, we will present the results later, but I want to talk through a couple highlights. First, cattle have to be trained to graze the T-Raptor. The T-Raptor is different than many of the forages that our cattle are used to. It usually takes about 3 days for them to learn that they are actually able to eat the brassica, and then they perform quite well on it. We graze the T-Raptor from late November on into March. One pasture we had grazed heavily pretty early on in the season because we had a flush of broadleaf winter weeds that the cattle would not eat, and we wanted to transition the pasture into ryegrass. Another field we harrowed and dissed in early February after we allowed the cattle to graze the T-Raptor out. However, since chemical suppression wasn't used, the T-Raptor actually returned and nearly outcompeted the late planted ryegrass. We didn't see much difference in the early and mid plantings of ryegrass, but we did plant those early treatments about 2 weeks later than anticipated because of heavy rains in early October. I would like to note that planting early can be risky, but planting late is even riskier. There's no guarantee that we'll be able to get that seed in the ground or that the moisture conditions would be more ideal than our normal planting window. We were actually only able to plant part of the areas we intended for late ryegrass because the fields were flooded for much of the late winter, and we could never get equipment into the field. You may notice that the grass in this video is pretty short, and while we never had a lot of tonnage, the grass was always there. When possible, we would apply 30 to 50 units of nitrogen to the fields, but the extreme wet and dry cycles this winter really restricted our ability to apply nitrogen to the fields or provide efficient use of that nitrogen by the plant. So instead of risking nitrogen loss through volatilization and leaching, we chose to not apply the nitrogen unless it was absolutely necessary, which was typically right after planting and once in mid-season if we could make it into the fields. As soon as the grazing is finished, we'll summarize the results and publish these in an expert advice article in the Georgia Cattleman's Magazine.